Hey, Christine.
Hey Pranab.
Uh, Welcome to my podcast. Uh,
Yeah.
Now, going into the internet, how did your relationship with Twitter start? What got you into this very online community?
Yeah. So I was on Twitter briefly, I want to say like 2016 or so, but it was mostly looking at jokes and I was consuming like just tweets. I wasn't posting. I also was very lightly in like design Twitter because I was becoming a designer. So kind of looking around that space, but didn't really find. I definitely wasn't posting. I definitely like didn't find my feed that insightful or interesting. I actually got into it through my boyfriend Brian, who showed me Visa's ebook and like a few tweets, and I thought it was so cool because I think that I am one. I was already like tweeting before I joined Twitter. Like I was like I was like journaling in my uh off days from climbing, like, oh, like here's my thoughts on this thing and here are my thoughts on that thing, and they were almost like tweet form, like they were like short snippets, but I wasn't using Twitter for it. So that was one side of it. I really liked Visa's writing. And then my therapist also got me into Twitter, partially because um, I had tried CBT and it wasn't working at all for me. And she was like, "Oh, what if you like looked that into IFS, internal family systems?" And she walked me through a guided meditation, and I was like sold. I was like, "Oh, like this makes sense to me. This feels right." Like I just really took to the idea. And then I saw Visa and Nick Camerata tweeting back and forth about how they speak to their parts in IFS, and that like really sold me. That was the second part, and the third part was probably Toshin had a really awesome article on how to use Twitter well, what to do, how to get set up, and so I followed those, and also a handful of accounts that Brian recommended. And between all of that, I really launched on. I was like, I want to talk about IFS. Like, who's out there to talk
Yeah,
about IFS with me?
I'm
Yeah,
pretty sure that's how I found your like Twitter presence. I was like, oh, this is
yeah,
someone talking about IFS. That's cool.
yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. Yeah, I
You
feel
were
like
big.
there's. I was.
You were like pivotal in my about like my getting onto
Oh yeah,
Twitter.
thank
Yeah,
you. It's kind of weird looking back at that, but it is interesting because I think there are these like small interactions that actually can lead to like some pretty big stuff. Let's
yeah.
say Tasha never posted the article, or Nick and Visa never had that conversation. There's a real
Hmm.
chance you like wouldn't have started using it.
Yeah,
Um,
and I mean, especially because I was just jumped on and like very much because I was so excited about IFS, I just started like being like, who's talking about this? How do I find these people? But you were the first person who was like a real person that talked to me on Twitter, was like, hey, let's video chat, let's talk about this, like reached out like a friend, and I was like so taken aback. I was like, whoa, like
yeah, I feel like
it
that's the
is,
thing I'm good at,
yeah.
and also just like I just don't even think about it. I kind of just assume, especially with Twitter, once like I'm mutual to someone, it's like, oh, I can just probably DM them. It's like definitely fine. And
Yeah, yeah.
it's really weird. I think like way back in ninth grade, I read How to Win Friends and Influence People or something. And as
Mm-hmm.
much as I don't want to admit it, I'm pretty sure it probably left some deep impression on my psyche. Because I was like an extremely antisocial middle schooler.
Whoa, no
And I think I
way.
read the
Oh my
thing.
God.
Oh yeah, I had like zero friends. Like sixth, like up until like sixth or seventh grade, and then every
Hmm.
year it kind of became like like a just like a just boom boom boom.
Wow.
Um, but I think in eighth or ninth grade, I read How to Win Friends and Influence People, and the line of like assume rapport just like kind of
Hmm.
stuck with me, and I was like, oh, you can just pretend they're your friends already, and you just lose the all the
Yeah,
fear
I
and
mean,
more or less.
you made me feel very comfortable like while doing this, and it was like my first person that I had truly interacted with at any like real depth, and I was like, you just made it seem really natural. So I was like, okay, yeah, let's like talk.
Sweet,
Yeah. So.
nice, nice. I'm glad. Yeah. I'm thrown off. What was I gonna say?
We're talking about like
Yeah,
Twitter.
yeah. Oh, yeah. And then also, so yeah. So IFS. So what was the difference between CBT and IFS for you? Like when you're working with your therapist with CBT, what did that feel like versus how IFS kind of was for you?
Yeah, CBT felt like homework. It was a lot of homework. I had these, and it wasn't bad. Like I actually think early on I had like sort of screenshotted a list of prompts from CBT that I actually found helpful. And it just had like all these different ways that you could be framing your thoughts, or like different like thinking traps of like, oh, are you like catastrophizing, or are you like thinking of it in from a specific context only, like, and I found that useful. CBT was also, it felt very prescriptive, like, okay, here is this thought you have in your head. What is the evidence for this thought? What is the counter evidence for this thought? How might you like reframe this thought, and I was like going
Kind of
through
robotic.
typing in. Yeah, well, I was like writing I was very like diligent. I like went and I wrote out all of the evidence, and and it was like helpful, but it just didn't feel as natural. Whereas IFS, it's like it feels more emotional. It feels more like, it feels like actual progress, like tangible. It feels like something has moved inside of myself, which I don't think
Mm.
I felt with CBT. With CBT, it was like very top down. IFS just felt like I accessed it at a certain, like a depth below that, and that it just feels different, and like
Mm.
and it feels better. Like it just feels like more like like an actual concrete step forward, instead of previously I felt like I was just kind of like, oh, coming back and like restructuring, and like it works, but it just felt like less intuitive. I also really like the somatic IFS side, where it's like more in your body. So yeah, I
Totally. Yeah, I think this idea of like top down versus shift or movement is a big thing that I think a lot of people in our circles talk about and get. But it's interesting because a lot of people who are just kind of new to it, don't really get what that mean.
hmm.
Curious what your take is on how you describe that, or describe it maybe in a different way, or what it feels like to someone who just doesn't instantly kind of get it from just like hearing those words.
Yeah, I guess I would describe it as like, let's say you're dancing, and top down would be like you memorize the choreography, and you're like, okay, I'm going to move my hand this way, and then I'm going to twirl, and I'm going to do this. Maybe even thinking about like the manuscript of the music, like, oh, like at the fourth beat I'm going to like stomp my foot. Whereas the more embodied version would be like, um, kind of all of that goes out the window, and you're just sort of like feeling the music and moving however you feel like, based on like your connection to the emotions. It's like a little hard to describe.
Yeah, a bit more
um
flow.
yeah, like it's, I guess you move without thinking, like it is something
Mm.
that is, I was like playing around and tweeting recently about like my body having a mind of its own, but like if your body were to just do its own thing and your mind, like, was shut off, like that would be how it feels to me to like dance, from a bottom up approach, as opposed to like memorizing the moves.
Right.
Yeah. So.
Right. And I think it's interesting because I think what that brings to mind for me is like this smooth brain meme. It's like smooth brain mode, you know? Or
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of
Yeah.
people also maybe have a fear of like what not thinking, especially the hyper
Yeah.
rationalist,
Oh
hyper
my
intellectual
god. Okay,
side
this
of people.
reminds me of there's a chapter in Impro by Keith Johnstone where it's like part, I don't know, probably like a core aspect of the impro like approach, the improvisational approach, is that you act before you think. So I feel like we're always taught, oh, think before you act, because there's all these like consequences that can come up if you're, being thoughtless. And Impro is saying that we've gone too far in that direction, and there's actually a lot of leeway between like you can act before you think in a lot more situations and actually have a lot of interesting and magical things come up that you haven't, you've probably canceled them out because you've been taught like, oh, you can't, like there's so many like restrictions. But yeah, that was actually really helpful for me while reading Impro. It's like, oh, like especially situations where you're like put on the spot, or like, like you're like, oh, like say something or sing whatever, like those like more spontaneous moments. The way to do it is to just like move your body, like just like follow, like do anything. And you'll often find that in the act, like there's like a split second of while you're acting that suddenly everything snaps into place and you like actually do something that like it all starts. But if you don't just act without thinking, nothing happens. So.
Yeah, it sounds like that kind of the middle way, or the A. Lamau meme with the boat and stuff.
Yeah.
You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
It's like or kind of the midwit meme. Like they're all kind of pointing at the same thing of just like these two poles that the synthesis is, or thesis, antithesis, synthesis. It's like it's a mix of both. Or even yin yang. Like all these things kind of point at the same type of vibe, is my whole sense.
It's all balance.
What about and what about so with IFS, do you feel like that meshed well with your journaling? Or did your journaling change once you got more into IFS?
Yeah, I mean, okay, so it's funny because I want to say in high school, or even like partway through college, I was like, I'm not a journaler. Like, I just can't do it. Like, I'm not consistent. Like, it's just not for me. But then my friend got me this like 1 line a day journal. And so all you do is write 1 line a day in it. And like on each page, it says like June 14th, 2000 and whatever. And then like the next year. And I was just doing this 1 line a day journal kind of casually. But suddenly I noticed like I was following the exact same trends every year. Like I would fall into a certain pit at a certain time of year. I would like start a new like relationship at a certain time of year, and I would go through the same thoughts and the same motions, and I was like repeating myself, and I was like, oh, like
cool.
What is going, and that was kind of one of the starts of like me get really liking journaling. And then I went traveling for climbing, and like then I had a travel journal because I wanted to capture the time of my life. And I also got into drawing, so like I had a long past with journaling. I have like stacks and stacks of journals. Yeah.
What was the time scale it took for you to kind of see that pattern? Because I think when you mentioned like over the course of years, it sounds like, or was it like a few months, or what was that like?
Honestly, the first part was slow. I mean, all of the things I'm describing, like climbing, I did for like 2 years before I got really addicted, and like journaling, probably 2 years or something. And I was like, I actually had an early thread about this of like how finding your passion or finding things that you want to be like a lifer at, like it is really about following your curiosity. And I think a lot of people don't realize that it can take a long time. And like, so it's very important that you're consistently curious or interested in this like little tiny thing, then it keeps you coming back. Yeah. Because sometimes it takes a long time. It just like, and you don't even realize it. Like I wasn't like, I want to get into journaling and I'm going to journal. I was just like, oh, I have this journal that my friend got me. I'll casually like do it. Yeah, exactly. And like same with climbing. Like I was just looking for like a thing to do. I thought it was kind of cool. I was just like, oh, I think I thought like the people were a little like strange at first, but I was like, oh, it's interesting. Like I'm gonna keep going. I thought It was like a very different context than my high school. And yeah, it's just like because you're continually curious and you keep going back, suddenly you're like, whoa, like this has built up. I have 2 years of journaling down. I can see the themes, and then it like really compounds. And so Yeah, it's
kind of
crazy
interesting. Yeah,
how
it's
much it
interesting to
compounds.
hear.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the fact that it took 2 years before you got addicted to it, or before it became like a thing you wanted to do more often.
Mm-hmm.
Like yeah, it's kind of interesting. I share that with so I'm learning Chinese, and I would say the first
Yeah.
year of learning Chinese, I just didn't really do it much.
Yeah.
It was in my mind for 2 years. Then I actually started doing it. Then I took a
Mm-hmm.
break. Now I'm
Yeah.
doing it with more
Yeah.
diligence. Even meditation, like I was kind of loosely into it for like three or
Mm-hmm.
4 years. Um,
Yeah.
but it took a while for it to like really catch, and it was only in the last 3 years that it like has become like a giant thing.
Yeah. Yeah. And
Yeah,
then
it's kind
like
of interesting.
you
And
go
go ahead.
ahead. No, you go.
Yeah, there's like a ton of things like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, I feel like there's a while for your curiosity to just be sort of like incubating, and then you suddenly like you almost have to not realize it's happening, and then it starts to catch, and you have these like increments of progress, and then your awareness shifts in, and you're like, oh, like I made some progress here, and then by that time you've sort of like probably made some friends, or like you've like built up different like a little system around it, and that's when it really starts to roll. um and I guess tying it back to what I was saying earlier about like the communities that cover multiple bases, I feel like when they do that, you get a really good system going, and then you can actually be like committed to this activity or community, something at like a deeper level. Like I definitely still consider myself a climber. Like I think that's like a lifetime hobby or passion of mine. Even though I've been out for like 3 years. But
Yeah, for sure.
yeah.
It's kind of interesting. I feel like in some ways, a lot of people, especially post college, talk about how it's really hard to make friends in adult life, and it kind of is,
Mm-hmm.
right? It can be really
Yeah.
difficult, but I would say it's like it's easiest when you can just join a cult. And I mean
Yeah.
that metaphorically, not like a literal cult, but like
Yeah.
if you could just find something that feels like it's like a culture or an organization or like a system or a thing that just draws you in, and it, it's weird because it's like on one, it's you're kind of towing a line. You want to balance it. You don't want it to like
Mm-hmm.
totally consume you, and you want it to be really interesting. You want it to be super fun, exciting, um,
Yeah. I
be
mean, people.
somewhat context agnostic.
Yeah. I mean, like people talk about how religion is that for a lot of people, and
I was gonna
that's
say
why.
it's like
Yeah.
return to church.
Yeah, yeah. Like
Uh,
church is a great example of a community that covers a bunch of your needs, or like different bases from different
yeah,
angles. Um, I think Teapot is interesting. It covers like socializing. It definitely feeds a part of myself that I wasn't getting enough of in the climbing community, which is like, I want to say like the more intellectually curious side of like everyone is has these ideas, everyone's creating things, or they're writing, they have like the whole like building in public. I mean, Visa has a whole set of norms that I think encourages this, and like that, I think the creation aspect was pretty much consumed by like rock climbing, and so there's like that's
totally.
like a big shift, and I love it. I think it's like really awesome to be surrounded by people
Yeah,
who have curiosity and interests. So
and I feel like you are like a integral uh, part of the creating process in the sense like I feel like every week or two you do something that's like it's like not lost in the ether in the sense that you do a good job of catching it and documenting it. Like
mm.
you have your thread of your favorite things and thread of threads, or you have your Google Doc
Oh.
of threads. Not many people have a
Yeah.
Google Doc. I think it's smart to do stuff outside of the Twitter format, especially if like it's December 2022. If Twitter goes from 280 characters to 4,000, that might be the death of it. But
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
Well, a lot
but
of
yeah,
my documented things are links to tweets, but a few of them I have like
right.
actually transferred, yeah, to Google Doc.
But,
So,
but even links to tweets, having them like on something that's easy to send, I think it's like
hmm
and I think it's easier to navigate than like a thread of threads kind of thing.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah. I mean, I was just like, I began using Twitter very much like for my own curiosity, right? I was like, oh, I want to talk to people
Yeah.
about IFS. And then I came across some like really funny tweets and I was like, this is great. But then I couldn't get back to my own thread. So that's how the Google Doc started. I just wanted to like see them all so I can easily bookmark. And the Twitter like bookmarks feature just doesn't do it for me. So yeah,
Makes
I'm a
sense.
big fan of using like Google Docs and um, I'm like a Google Docs and like Notes app person.
Nice.
Spread like
The
yeah,
essentials,
yeah,
which is good. I think I feel like I tend to be one of those people caught up in tools. It's like, oh, how's this PKM versus that PKM, and I end up just not really using
yeah,
much of it.
yeah,
But it's something I've been learning and leading into is just do the thing you need to do to solve your problem, and that'll kind of stuff will emerge.
yeah. I got burned by Evernote. I once had
Mm.
a sprawling second brain of sorts in college on Evernote, and then I think they like changed their subscription plan, and I was like out of Evernote. And ever since then, I've just been like,
Wow.
oh yeah, like I'm not
At
going
that
to
time,
sink my put my eggs into a basket like that again.
were you into? Was it specifically like BASB, like Tiago Forte stuff, or was it just kind of your own
No,
version of
it
everything?
was just like a bunch of stuff that I had collected because I like to collect all kinds of stuff, so it was
Totally.
just um
Yeah, I feel like I feel like you. We both like to collect things. I think I just collect them in my head, so and it comes out in conversation, which is far less, which has far less utility than having it on like an actual artifact. Uh, Speaking of which,
yeah.
one of the artifacts that you made that I think is really cool is your life timeline. And going
Mm.
back to the church thing, you mentioned it's like there's like some part in your life timeline. It's just like Google sheet of like a timeline kind of thing. And it's a really cool thing. I'll probably try to link to it or something in the show notes. But it's at some point you became atheistic, and then recently in like this year it said you became agnostic. So curious how that lands with you.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think I was agnostic. I was raised atheist, but then I was like, no, I'm agnostic. Um, just because I didn't feel sure about there not being anything. But I went to like a like religiously affiliated university. And I took a few like theology classes, and um, I think that it was just like it felt very clear to me that when we like that it was like obvious that there's nothing after. Like it felt
Nice.
like clearly um we like return to dirt, and like I don't know where all this like extra faith and whatnot was coming from. And then I went on a rock climbing. It was like a traveling thing, and I think I was just like so struck by um, one of the nights that I was out. I was like, uh, we were climbing at night, and the way the universe was almost like spiraling around us, I was like so struck by it that I felt like this first inkling of like, oh, maybe I'm not so like sure about there not being anything. And I think just this is still, I wouldn't say I have like an extremely strong stance on either of these, but it does feel like I'm moving more back towards like being agnostic than atheist. So yeah.
Yeah, makes sense. And it sounds like that was like kind of a taste of like noetic or the mystical or the transcendental or something like
Mm-hmm.
that. Is that would you describe it that way?
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like there's certain pivotal moments in my life where I feel very struck by certain messages. Like it feels um like the muse or like the larger stuff. It's like very present. Like it's extremely viscerally there. And like those are the moments where I'm just like, oh wow, like maybe there's like
Yeah.
something there. And like I also have those, not just with like a larger presence, but like with certain values. Like I have like values that I hold in my life, and I'm like, oh, like this feels like a moment where I actually have crystallized a principle or like a way of living, and like I hold that. And like journaling helps me actually like write it down and feel like I actually remember this and can come back to it and revisit it and revise it over time and see if I still believe that. But like it usually does come from like a moment in my life where I'm like, oh, like either struck by like beauty or like some experience happens. And yeah. So.
What are some of your values?
Yeah, there's a lot. I value kindness. I value, so one that came to me was that I value beauty, which I did not as growing up. But there was like a moment in my travels where I was so struck by like the same moment that I'm talking about, where I was like, oh, maybe there is something there where, yeah, just like the stars. I was in South Africa, and they just really filled me with an appreciation, and I was like, okay, I actually do now hold this in my life. I value growth, humor. Yeah, I think I have almost like a wall in my head. I have like this stone wall. Sometimes it's a basement, but mostly it's like a stone wall of like values. And I have really vivid dreams. I have this thread on like all the wild dreams I have, but partially in a dream, and also just like this imagery of like this like wall of values, and I will come back occasionally and like hit them and be like, is it still stable? And based on, and sometimes they like swivel, and those are like the times where I'm like, whoa, like my values have changed, like something like the wall looks different now. But typically, like once the stone is set, I feel like, oh, this is like a really heavy stone, this is like a value that I hold. And like I will come back and I'll test it. And I think that's important to do. Like it's funny that you asked, because I've definitely go through cycles where like I'll write down like my 10 or 13 values, and then I'll like write little sentences, excerpts, and then I come back a few years later, because I've have my journals, or like just like occasionally we'll flip through my drawings and I'll see it again and I'll be like, oh, do I still value that? I value altruism. Like I think it's important to be good. There's like, yeah, so like there's like a whole list of those, and then I come back and I revisit, and I try to. There was one point where I tried to like measure my life every day against these values, but that wasn't sustainable. So.
It can be a little hard to sustain.
Yeah.
Well, it's kind of interesting. One thing that struck me: you are a very visual person. There's a lot of you have a lot of mental imagery, a lot of dreams, a lot of vividry. Yeah. Even in your tweets and writing, it's a lot of kind of it's very picturesque. You can imagine it. I am not. I have really shitty, visual sense of like yeah. It's just not. It doesn't really come to me. And I'm kind of curious, when you do IFS, you talked a lot about the somatic parts of it. Was there a kind of an order or a shift in how you do IFS, or is it kind of like developed over time as it relates to kind of imagery versus somatic? Because it sounds like, and I ask because some people seem to be more somatic in their IFS, and some people seem to be more imaginal in their IFS.
Yeah. Yeah. Before I even get into that, I think that the imaginal like thinking and like relating is actually something that I noticed in myself and actually like developed also. So like you mentioned that you like collecting something, like it's like you notice things that about like your default mode of operating that they can be hard to notice because it's so like ingrained in you. I didn't realize that I liked collecting certain things, or that the way I was sometimes you don't even realize, but when you do notice them, if you like sort of develop it or like lean into it, I think that's what it gets really interesting, because you're like uniquely positioned to do that. But yeah, for IFS, it actually began much more visual, and then I began to notice the somatic sides, and I read somatic IFS, and then I like really learned more about that aspect of it. I don't think that the somatic side was not there before, but immediately visual. Like one of the first things I did with IFS was I drew out a bunch of parts. Like when I first discovered IFS, it was really wild because I met like 8 parts, or like 8 to like 50, like a ton of parts at once, and I was like, oh my god, like this is so like interesting, and I couldn't contain how excited I was by this. So that's why I was like left onto Twitter and was like, what's going on? Yeah.
And it sounds like so IFS for you seems to be very character driven. Is that right?
Yes.
Like, or like, what is IFS like for you? Like, how what does it feel like, and what is it like? Because I found that I definitely do IFS a bit differently than other people, and it seems like IFS is. I mean, when we say IFS, we're kind of referring to this basket of a bunch of different somatic type stuff that I mean, internal family systems is kind of the root, but I think everyone kind of adds on their own kind of nuances to it and makes it their own thing over time. So kind of curious, what's yours look like now? And
yeah, it's really evolved. And it's also, I love Twitter because one of my favorite things was like, what are your internal family members like? You know, like, are they characters? And if so, what kind of characters? Is there a landscape? Is there like a feeling? Is there a way they show up? Is it just like these sort of transient, senses, or is it a lot more concrete? And people had like all kinds of answers. It was all across the board. I think that it's not uncommon for the characters to feel almost a little bit cartoonish or like childish. I think that the subconscious often is like symbolic, and that's like a thing that can show up. And yeah, it's sometimes I'm like, oh, I wish that things dealing with like your emotions was more complex, or not that it's not complex, but like more like intellectually complicated, because I'm like, oh, it's like it all comes down to love or something like that. It just feels like
something cheesy, like, something kind of lame.
yeah, exactly.
I feel
that. Yeah, it's definitely I have a regular cast for sure. And after the regular cast, I think I have a lot of peripheral, like, less regular. And especially with the somatic side is really wild to me. I think there's a whole other world that's deeper that I haven't accessed yet, and they do live in these like what I call like the regular cast. They're very verbal, and their presence is much more like they're closer to my subconscious. So if I were to have like inner conflict or things like that, like it feels like that's them, whereas there's like these underlying like cast characters or like parts that I'm just like I don't have as immediate. They're not as verbal. They're not. They just operate differently. But one thing that I think IFS like was like one feeling that I got from IFS that I really value is that feeling of trust built up between my parts. So it's almost like if someone were not familiar with IFS, I would describe it as like building up familiarity with your modes of existence. So the ways that you show up in your life in different contexts, in different emotional states, and just like feeling that you are one, like able to recognize how you show up in those moments, and know what you need, and also feel that you can like trust yourself to be able to like give yourself what you need in those moments.
Could you that's been my experience, and it's been really key. At the same time, I feel like if I were to tell myself that 3 years ago, I would have no idea what I'm saying. What's kind of the like what are kind of those modes of being for you that show up in IFS?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's there's like so many, like I said, there's like the regulars, right? I have one mode of being that, or like one part. The first part that really came to me was very much like insecurity, which is so cool because I feel like that part has grown so much. I'm just like so proud. But like, yeah, just like how I appear when I am feeling like insecure. And the somatic part of it that I think also showed up right away, but I didn't even like have words to put to it until I read Somatic IFS, was this feeling of like self touch, in that like I would almost imagine myself either holding this part like a cat or something, or like holding their hands, and like that felt really comforting, and just like the feel, it's very much like a self-love exercise. But yeah, that was one mode of being. There's another that comes up a lot, which is when I'm feeling like kind of reckless, or like just wanting to, maybe like feeling kind of nihilist, just wanting to like say, you know, screw it all.
Burn it down.
That one, yeah, that one.
Yeah.
That part's fun. I have a
That's
fun
cool.
time, but like, yeah, we're on good terms. There's like a lot of, you know, just like building good relationships with yourself.
100%. Yeah, I think for me, a few recurring part patterns I sometimes call them constellations, because
Oh,
it's
cool.
usually for me it's not often just one part, but kind of the stuff that comes as a result of it, and
Hmm.
so it's like there's like multiple
Constellations.
at once.
That's a much nicer way to put it. In No Bad Parts, they call them like cloves, like garlic cloves.
Oh, yeah. Oh, really? That's kind of
Yeah.
ugly. That sounds
Yeah.
weird.
I like
Oh,
constellations.
that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I kind of use constellations in two different ways, but at least in this way, with parts, it's like I have like a carb part, but what I mean by that is like I for a year I would like I would walk by, I'll walk by a cookie store.
Hmm.
There's one of my favorite cookie stores in San Francisco is Hot Cookie in DeCastro, and I'll
Okay.
walk by it and I'll smell the smell of like a really nice cookie, and I'm like, I should go in there and get a cookie, and it's like out of comfort or out of some kind of scarcity thing. And the
Oh
story I tell
yeah.
myself is that like when I was a kid, when I was like in like fourth through seventh grade, I would like buy those Pillsbury take and bake cookies and make them for my brother and I, and it was really good. And it's also probably why I
Yeah.
was called a cookie
I
can. Yeah,
absolutely have a similar part, like a very much like a, her name's like Rubber, but like very like greedy. Like there's like a very
rubber.
specific, yeah, there's a very specific
Oh,
feeling like in my body. It's like kind of like a tight
yeah.
string. And it's like I need it, you know. And she has like huge arms. So like I said, the first thing I did with IFS was like I like doodled out a bunch of my parts. And oh my god, one part that was extremely wild to me was that when I drew out my parts, I realized that the same characters, because I've been journaling for years and years, and I've been like drawing, they show up over and over throughout my journal entries over the years. And so it's like,
Wow.
yeah, I was like, like, what is this?
And this is before you really got into IFS as a practice.
um, the way they showed up in my journals, yeah, that was way before I knew about IFS.
Yeah. But they were still recurring. So like the
Yeah,
same
yeah, yeah.
recurring like symbols or characters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
That's cool.
exactly.
That's really
Yeah,
interesting.
yeah, yeah. So,
Damn.
yeah.
Yeah, I think yeah, because I think for me, it's they often a lot of times it's situational, so it kind of arises and then tends to go away. But it's both situational and recurring, like recurring cast kind of thing. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
I think that journaling, IFS, and existential kink, like those three have felt like a really powerful combination for like personal
yeah.
growth.
What does existential kink or EK mean to you? That's I think the thing that it seems like you're not most recently, but more recently than IFS kind of gotten into, right?
Yeah, maybe. They were, I mean, I had a bit of a peak in like June, which is like, it's only like 6 months ago, but I feel like there's been such
Right.
changes since then. It's so
Oh,
wild.
for sure.
Um, yeah, I read the book. The book is a little bit goofy, definitely. Like the cover is like a little bit dramatic, Twilight-ish looking cover. Like some people
Little
are
50
turned
Shades of
off.
Grey.
Yeah, yeah. Some people are turned off by it. I'm like, that's a shame because it's a really powerful idea. It's shadow work. It's very much like the idea of the things that you really dislike about yourself or the things that you really struggle with, trying to turn that idea on its head. So let's say you struggle with um, well, for me, I was like, I'm like extremely introverted, and so I struggled a lot with like social anxiety, and so and I didn't like it. Like it was like you would if you ask me, do you like being anxious sometimes, like before you go to a party? I was like, no, I don't like it. So existential kink is like taking something that you struggle with and flipping it on its head and being like, what if you were kinky or like into this somehow in like a masochistic way, and so you are enjoying inflicting this kind of like pain on yourself. And so if you imagine it like that, then the way you would say it to yourself in your head is like, oh god, like, oh no, I am feeling anxious again, like, oh, I hate it, but like it's like sarcastic now, like, and by doing this you're removing the seriousness of it. I
Yeah.
think the way that I describe it is like if before your eyes were like glued to a TV screen, you're watching a horror show and you're like, oh my god, like this is so scary, this is horrifying. Existential kink, what it allows you to do is like you can like eat some popcorn or you can like get up and go to the
Yeah.
bathroom. Like it just like removes that like immediacy. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I think it's in a way like some people laugh at horror movies or find them funny, and it's kind of a similar kind of thing.
Yeah.
For me,
Yeah.
it makes things kind of it's yeah. In some ways, I'm sarcastic. In general, it just like makes everything goofy because I think
Mm-hmm.
that the thing with the parts that you don't like about yourself, like are typical, in terms of the shadow, and shadow is used in a few different ways, but in this sense, it's kind of the simplistic shadow, like the thing that we don't like about ourselves.
Yeah.
Um, and for me, it's often I'm procrastinating again, or it's like I skipped a
Mm-hmm.
workout, or like why did you know what I mean? And it's helpful and it's easy to kind of go from that into a downward spiral of beating yourself up and being angry and resisting and having all the reactionary parts from that. But I feel like
Yeah.
EK, or at least like a shadow work approach that is kind of similar to this, because typically with IFS, it's like, oh, it's okay. It's like you're gentle, you're nice, you're kind of soothing. It's very caring and
Mm-hmm.
nurturing, a little serious. It's very like kind of somber in some ways,
Yeah.
even if it is loving. But with existential kink, you're
Yeah.
like, you fucking liked that, didn't you? Like you, I bet you, there's something
Yeah.
about you that kind of like
Exactly.
enjoyed this. It's like, what am I getting away with by doing this? And you kind of like not doing my word,
Yeah,
huh? It's like, yeah,
yeah,
I get to play
yeah.
games. It's kind of fun not working out. I like being a lazy slob sometimes.
Yeah,
It's nice. It
exactly.
makes you
Like,
admit the thing about yourself that like you don't like admitting, and then it makes it easy to just uncover.
hmm
It takes away all the reification and pain, and just makes it light.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I think like going back to my earlier example, I realized that like so I moved around a lot as a kid. I was like kind of proud of being the new girl and like being like okay with either be like if I got like ostracized or like if I didn't, if I like made it back, you know, like all of that was like a common theme. And I think I like actually liked it. Like I never wanted to be in, you know, like I liked being like the outsider. And so
Was
I
it?
think
But
it
was
like
it?
made
At
me
some point, did
realize
it cause you
that.
problems,
Um
or is it something
I
that at some point you were like, "Oh, I wish I wasn't," or kind of like that story?
I think I the reason why I was like this is a good area for me to try the existential kink stuff on is because it felt like the amount of like anxiety spikes were like way higher because I've like traveled solo across the world. Like I've shown up in a campground in like South Africa. You know, I like made friends. So like I obviously have the
That's cool.
ability to like be this new person and like make friends and socialize, but for some reason it was just like such a fear and like anxiety, like it gripped my body and I was like what is going on here, and
Right.
like I think I liked the roller coaster. Like I think I liked the like I'm not gonna
Right.
make it and I make it and it's like oh and like that's like the kinky part, right? Like that's like the
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
For sure. That's interesting. Yeah. 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 Because it's like there's a part of you like initial state. It's like, oh, I'm going to this thing, and you're really anxious and nervous. And then there's another part of you, then you realize there's a part of you that's just like, wait, but I like doing this. Like I like you know what I mean? And
Yeah, yeah,
it's having both coexist allows it to kind of melt, and you can still
yeah.
have, and it's almost like, and the interesting thing is, it's not going away. It's almost like it doesn't necessarily, and sometimes
You
it
know
kind of
like you
drops
learn
out,
to
but it
enjoy
often
it.
just kind of stays away. Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, it's
And it
very non-dual in that sense.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And it kind of so IFS is interesting. One concept I really like from IFS is the idea of dimming things, and I do think existential kink does that a little bit, where like you're just when you're blended with a part, it's impossible to turn it off. You can't just like stop feeling that way. But what you can do is ask the part to dim it, like dim the reactions that it's having, and so um, it feels like with existential kink, you just are able to make a little bit of distance between yourself and whatever is happening, and that's all you need really to feel like oh, like I'm fine now. So.
Yeah, yeah. I find that like it's that first break in distance from a thing, because
Mm-hmm.
when you or someone else is just like merged inside of like a of a feeling or of a part or blended or however you want to call it, it's just like it's like you're fused with the mind, you're fused with like that emotional state. You don't even realize that's the frame you're coming from, and there's not much you
Yeah.
can really do about it. You kind of just have to wait until it passes. And I find that a lot of techniques, either explicitly or not, try to get you out of that. Like CBT tries to get
Mm-hmm.
you like
Yeah.
get out of that while you're in it. It's like, oh, this is, and you're kind of leaning on someone, you trust in someone who has this kind of like authority to tell you what's distorted or not. And with IFS, it's about feeling into this self energy, which can be hard to do. It's not an easy thing, and it can be a little complicated, but um, at the same time, it's also really
Yeah.
simple. So it's interesting.
It's so wild. Like you're asking me about like IFS astral kink, and like I do feel like I had like a curve with IFS. Like, and I'm still like ongoing with IFS, but there was like a definite peak. Um, and
Mm,
now I feel like I am still very much. I still do like parts work, and but it's just like I feel like I've come to the end of one cycle, for at least for now. And what I've gotten out of it is this feeling of like being held by myself and like understanding myself
mm.
like much more clearly. I definitely think in the past I did a lot of journaling, but I felt like I was like people would be like, "Oh, you're so like you're so mysterious," and I'd be like, "Well, like." I don't really get myself either. And now I'm like, oh no, I totally do. Like I actually have mapped it out. Like I mapped out all of these parts that I've met so far, and like it's just way more clear. And it's really satisfying because not only have I mapped out these parts, I feel that I have like a bond. So like I like two parts of myself. And so I not only can like I'm familiar with them, and when any of them are like feeling something, like there's like a trigger and they like pull on that like bus cord, I can reach out immediately. Like myself is more present, and I can be like, oh, like let me like hold your hand for a little bit because you're feeling a little bit like you need more attention. And so in that way, it just feels like I am like my like self-love is stronger through all these little fibers, that I never would have thought to do that through. I don't know. I just like the framework wasn't available for me to like do that before.
Right. Like
Yeah,
journaling is an
yeah.
act, but it's not necessarily a process. Like it doesn't have this kind of like
The
framework
network,
process.
yeah, exactly. Like the webbing of it is like really made sense to me, and I was like, oh, that was like the key. Like I like grabbed it, and I was like,
Yeah.
okay, now
Oh,
I'm good.
yeah. In some ways, it's like it's what makes IFS hard to enter and also so helpful. It's its ontology. And by ontology, I mean
Mhm.
like the way it looks at the world and the way it believes the mind is structured, or at least like the way you can imagine the mind is structured and
Yeah.
work with it in a certain sense. Journaling is less, it's not very prescriptive, which is the benefit of it, right? And you can do it. You can just start writing.
Yeah.
With IFS, there's kind of like a way to do it and a way to look at it. But
Mhm.
when you take on that view, that's what actually gets you the juice.
Yeah, I think definitely like the continuity of a part. Like with journaling, you can like go and go and go, but like first of all, you don't actually connect one moment from one in your past, and also you don't go into these like layers. Like there is like a process of, oh, like you're feeling this way. How do you feel towards the way that you're feeling? Like kind of removing all the protectors and then getting to like the core. Like it's pretty much just a way to get to the core of it, which can be hard if you're just journaling and you aren't like digging deep enough, or you're getting like blind, you're getting like swept away by the protector parts. So um
For sure. Yeah, and a couple things that stand out to me. Do you feel like parts should always be there? Because I think that's something that some people. So
yeah.
I remember Tim made a thread on, a part wants to be integrated, which means it feels like it's actually gonna die, and some people actually
Mhm.
do. They say integrated, they kind of mean the part goes away and you just have self. Other people take on the role that they take on the view that like each part should kind of a different role within the whole ecosystem. Um, or like it's
Yeah.
like the same motivation but it changes, and other people just kind of leave the parts as they are but just have a more friendly relationship with them. What's your take?
Yeah, yeah. So when you read like the IFS books, what happens is when there's like unburdened parts, like that is a thing. And typically after you unburden a part, it's much happier and is able to take on things that it wants to do that it wasn't doing before because it was busy being in pain or protecting the one who's in pain, like all of these things. Um, so there is that concept. And I've heard a lot of opinions about like being only in self and like having fully integrated all the parts, and it's just one, especially like from like different people on Twitter. I've heard like, oh, that's actually how it is for them. I don't think I'm there yet. I really enjoy having unburdened parts. Like I love being on my own because it's like a great time to hang out with myself and all my parts, and like it's because I've like worked with a lot of them to um yeah, to like unburden. It just feels like nice. I don't know. I don't think
For
for
sure.
me it doesn't feel like one block. It feels maybe more like an orchestra or like a symphony. Like there's a lot, but they
Totally.
all like work together. It's like a harmonized
Yeah.
symphony. So
And even from a meditative point of view, I think there's the there is a view in meditation that like everything becomes one, or it's all oneness and whatever. And I think that's interesting and cool, and in a sense also a bit not necessarily naive, but not necessarily, maybe not fully developed. And what I mean by that is, it's good to have kind of that sense of oneness while also having a sense of divisiveness, like at the same time. And I think that's that's a way to represent one ideal of IFS. It's like you have self and you have this orchestra, and everything's harmonized, and you have a good harmony,
Yeah.
but it's still separate. You know,
Yeah.
it's
That's
versus I
definitely
think
how it
like a
feels to
previous.
me. Yeah.
Exactly. Versus like a prior state, and part of where I'm coming from is like it's good to enjoy every part of the journey. Like we said, right? Maybe at
Mhm.
some point it might change for you, but it's really
Mhm.
nice to be able to enjoy where it's at and really kind of sit with that well right now. And even before, I think the point of EK and IFS and all this stuff is even when you have moments of like fighting and dissonance and polarization where you have a part that's hated by another part, that's hated by another part, and all these layers, and they're all kind of
Yeah.
being able to like you can even enjoy that even a little bit, like 1%, and then once you actually kind of work with it and soften it and melt it, you can enjoy it like 7% or I don't know,
Mhm.
23%, and it gets a little easier to work with, and it becomes this more kind of self-trusting ecosystem type thing.
Exactly, exactly. Yeah, it feels very much, I would say that my current inner state feels very much like a orchestra or symphony that learned to harmonize, and it's just like, oh, like all the parts are there, but it's like really nice, and they haven't yet gotten to a point where they're all playing like the same note, and suddenly it feels like one
Mm-hmm.
note, but it's like they're in harmony, and it feels like they've all like clicked into place. It's like a good good
For
place
sure.
to be.
And do you find that this is, and you mentioned that this phase is over. And what was kind of the beginning? Like, is it over because you've had that sense of harmony? Is that what feels, is that the kind of finality to it in some sense?
It's over in the sense that there's a period where I was just encountering parts left and right. Like they were just like, whoa, like, oh my god, here's another one, here's another one. And now they haven't in a while. Or like even the ones that have don't feel like main characters. Like they feel like less like formed. So I feel like my next phase is probably getting to that like deeper layer and getting to know maybe like less verbal parts.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I do think that the initial phase, it feels very like I've gotten what I feel like is a kernel of like self love, inner harmony, like self trust. The way I talk to myself when I see myself in the mirror or like when I fail is like much nicer than it was before. Like that, I don't know. It just feels like, oh, I made like
Yeah.
a tangible amount of something. It does feel like there's some kind of ending of a wave. So yeah,
Right.
yeah.
And does it feel so in a sense it's the end of a wave, but not necessarily the end of the whole process?
No, no. I mean, the concept, there's no end to a concept, right? I don't think that,
Right.
like, I think it's been so, like, transformative for the way I think about myself that I'm just like, oh, like, this is, it's so catchy. I don't know. I feel like even if you, like, bring it up to someone and you're like, oh, like, so the mind is multiple, and, like, it's just, like, let
Right.
that, like, form in their heads, like, it's already taken shape. So I don't think that I'm going to like maybe I'll just move on. I feel like it is possible to achieve some sort of in some state where you're fully happy and like you no longer have to work on yourself, but I don't know if I'm sure I will
Yeah.
have more obstacles in my future. Like
Totally.
so
Yeah, my how I view that, it's like it's kind of like it's an equilibrium, or it's like a meta state where it's like
mhm.
there'll always be waves. Sometimes really big
Yeah.
waves. Sometimes really
Mhm.
intense storms, and you're kind of floating along the wave. But
Mhm.
IFS kind of gives you like a bigger boat, or it makes it
Yeah.
like a kind of like more sturdy ship, which doesn't mean that the ship's not going to rock. Hopefully just means that you're able to like work with stuff and, you know, kind of restabilize, be a little bit faster, a little bit gentler, a little bit easier.
Yeah, definitely. I think like I'm also able to access different emotions more than I used to. Like there's like doors that have been opened where I'm just like, whoa, I have never gone there inside, like to that degree of emotion or something, and like now it's like opened and I'm just like it does feel like, oh, now I have more, like I've like passed the first wave, now
Totally.
let's see what happens next. Yeah.
Do you think that so this is kind of a bit of a change, but there's also when you tell someone the mind is multiple or made of different parts, one thing I've seen go viral on Twitter is DID, like dissociative identity disorder, which I think previously was called multiple personality disorder.
Yeah.
And what are your thoughts on the differences between the two? One is typically thought of as maladaptive, or, I mean, in kind of in a more stigmatized way. It's like, oh, that's crazy, like that's a crazy person, or whatever, right? I think we can see that it's just kind of a thing that can happen. But yeah, how do you view that as different than IFS or similar?
Yeah, totally. I think like if anyone starts being like, I have like, if you're like, oh, I have all these voices in my head, then people start to think you're crazy, right? I think it's a spectrum, and I think that's how Richard Schwartz talks about it too, is that he actually views that as like extreme cases of IFS, and that like if you think about it, we all talk about inner conflict. Like the whole angel on one shoulder and the devil on the other is like a common like trope. And we don't think that they're crazy. It's just like a visualization of inner conflict. And like we are capable of all kinds of emotions, and like I don't think that yeah, for me, in my mind, it's very much like a spectrum of how far it can go. So yeah,
for sure. Yeah, I feel like that probably deserves its own like whole topic and conversation, because I think once you get into, I feel like this is kind of like once you get into this, once you open up IFS, for better or worse, it kind of opens up a lot of questions around like multiple personalities, and like I've heard of tulpas, and also kind of like entities and angels and demons, like all this really interesting stuff that seems like crazy out there, but could be modeled within an IFS frame. And, you know, are they inside or outside? All this stuff. I feel like we're at a pretty good stopping point. So I'll
okay.
You know, any closing thoughts? Anything else you got in mind?
No, I really enjoyed this. I think it's like really cool to get to talk to people. Like, you know, you were a big part of me getting on Twitter, and it feels like everyone's having these conversations, and it's cool to be able to like talk about it and share it and go like a little deeper into it. So yeah, thanks for having me. It was good to chat.
Thanks for joining. Good podcast one. Good experiment.
Yeah.